Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Bhakti Fundamentals. Thank you all for your active listening and your questions. We love answering them in our talks. In fact, today's discussion will answer some recent questions that we received on the topic of God and how we relate to Him. Today's talk is actually the first installment of our promised mini-series about the Absolute Truth, or God as we more commonly know Him. In this talk, part 1, we begin what will ultimately be a very deep dive into the nature of God as He reveals Himself in the Bhagavad Gita. Now, the specific topic of today's talk is Brahman, which is a preliminary perspective on the Absolute Truth, as we will find out shortly. But first, let's provide a little context, which I think will get you more enlivened about this subject matter and orient you. A win-win. We love win-wins, don't we? Okay, so in the Bhagavad Gita, there are two main speakers, God, or the Supreme Lord, and Arjuna, who is a person, an individual soul. And the Gita is essentially a philosophical conversation between these two speakers, between God and someone like us. In the painting on screen, Krishna is depicted standing up, providing instructions, and Arjuna is sitting down, listening. If you've read it, you'll remember that the Gita is actually completely riveting and impressive in its scope. It covers in great detail the nature of the self, the nature of action, of time, and of this material world. However, there is another topic covered in the Gita. The top one in the image on screen, that is meant to represent the topic of God Himself. And this is a topic about which we should really be on the edge of our seats to hear about, because we really don't learn about God in other spheres of our life, do we? So this is really significant, that in the Gita, we hear details about God from God Himself. And probably the most amazing piece of information we learn is that we can know God on a personal level. We learn in the Gita that God has personality. In fact, He is the Supreme Personality from which all of our personalities derive. Since He is the Supreme Person, He has a name, which is Krishna, and this name refers to His original form as the Supreme Person. The name Krishna means all attractive, because His personal form is the most attractive form in all of existence. If we think about it, in this world, there are attractive people of both genders, right? But their attractive features have an origin. That origin is the Supreme Person, who has the quality of being supremely attractive, the most attractive. And why wouldn't God be the most beautiful person? Actually, all beauty in this world and in all of material existence comes from Him. Now, although the Supreme is ultimately personal, He also has an impersonal feature. After all, He is God. Thus, He encompasses everything. He is both personal and impersonal, and there is no contradiction in Him being so. As God, He can perfectly harmonize opposites. He can be both personal and impersonal, and that doesn't cause a problem. We'll understand more about this momentarily. So in the Gita, Krishna also describes His other aspects, His other features. This means that He describes other ways of seeing or relating to Him. All in all, He describes 3 aspects or features: His impersonal Brahman feature, His localized Paramatma feature, and His personal Bhagavan feature. Bhagavan is Krishna, the Supreme Person. Now, why does Krishna give us information about His other features if He wants us to cultivate a personal relationship with Him? Well, He wants to give us the fullest picture of Himself. To love someone fully, it helps us to know about them. Thus, in the Gita, Krishna gives us all of the details that we need to know all about him, and ultimately to relate to him on a personal level. Now, all this talk about knowing God on a personal level brings up an interesting point. There are two schools of thought among transcendentalists, or spiritual seekers: the personalist and the impersonalist schools of thought. On the impersonalist side are those who believe God is ultimately an impersonal force behind all of existence. However, we come to learn in the Gita that this is really just the most basic understanding of God. It is incomplete. On the other side is personalism, in which we understand that God is the supreme person who happens to have an impersonal feature. To try to grasp this point, there is a little exercise I like to carry out, and that is to reflect on a time when you have been treated impersonally by someone, by a person. And then try to remember how it made you feel. To be a person means to have personal thoughts and feelings, personal characteristics and qualities, likes and dislikes, personal talents, hobbies, and goals. It also means to desire personal relationships and connections with others. In reflecting on the above questions, I noted that when someone treats me impersonally, I feel distanced from that person, cut off and dismissed, as if there is no real relationship with them. I feel unimportant and insignificant to them. By contrast, when someone treats me personally, I feel special and important to them, like I matter to them. I want to reciprocate with someone who treats me personally. I feel grateful and appreciative towards them. Now, the first point of this exercise is to show that persons, like you or me, can act impersonally. Similarly, God is the supreme person, but he also has an impersonal feature. The picture on screen is meant to convey how we feel when we are treated impersonally, or when we treat others impersonally. We feel like we're not seen clearly, like we're not being treated as the persons we are. And when we treat others impersonally, we also miss the opportunity to see and interact with others as persons. The second point of this exercise is to show that if we like to be treated personally, then we can imagine that God also likes if we relate to him personally, if we cultivate a unique personal relationship with him. We will actually have a whole class dedicated to how we treat God personally in Bhakti Yoga. However, for now, one important point to note is that Krishna's personal feature, the Bhagavan feature, includes his impersonal Brahman and localized Paramatma aspects. It includes his other two features and is therefore higher than the other two. And thus, knowing Krishna as a person is the highest and most complete understanding of the Supreme Lord. Now next, you may be wondering, where do we fit into this discussion about God? Well, we learn in Shastra, or the scriptures, that we are one with the Supreme, or Krishna, in quality, but we are at the same time different from him in quantity. He is infinite, and we are finite, individual souls. While we are in essence spiritual beings like Krishna is, we are not the supreme person. We are not the creator of the material worlds and the sustainer of all existence. So we are one in spiritual quality, but we are not quantitatively equal to the Supreme. We are like a drop from the ocean. A drop of ocean water is chemically equal to the whole ocean, but not equal to the ocean in quantity. Now next, a useful graphic for us. If we envision the impersonalism to personalism spiritual perspectives on a horizontal line or spectrum, it will help provide us with context, because then we can imagine the three features or aspects of the Supreme, Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan, on this spectrum. With Brahman being all the way on the impersonal side, Bhagavan appearing all the way on the personal side, and the Paramatma aspect lying somewhere in the middle. Because as we'll see in part 2 of our mini-series, we don't relate to Krishna as the Supreme Person yet at the Paramatma stage of realization. And here it's helpful to add to our discussion that another reason Krishna describes his 3 features or aspects is because we, the individual souls, desire to relate to him in different ways. And the Supreme actually reciprocates with us according to how we want to relate to him. Krishna states as much in the Gita, in chapter 4, verse 11, in which he declares, "As they, or all of us, take shelter of me, I reward them accordingly." Krishna, as the Supreme Lord, is aware of everything and knows if we want to have a relationship with him and how. Now, these 3 features of God, Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan, are all spiritual understandings of him, and yet there is still a hierarchy to them, with the highest perspective being the Bhagavan realization of the Supreme as the Supreme Person, as Krishna, with whom we can have a personal relationship. So the first of these aspects or features of the Supreme, Brahman, is all the way over on the impersonal side. And why is that? As we hinted at previously, the Brahman or impersonal feature of Krishna is a preliminary understanding of the Supreme. When someone comes to know or realize Brahman, this means that someone in the very beginning of spiritual enlightenment realizes God as being the background of material and spiritual existence, as the underlying unifying principle behind all life, who is undifferentiated and indistinct. To understand or realize the Brahman feature of God means to realize the eternal feature of the Supreme, that the Supreme is eternal existence. Brahman realization is realization of the spiritual oneness of the Absolute. Now, it's important here to note that Brahman, impersonal as this feature is not without any qualities. We can still describe Brahman as we have been just now. Therefore, even the impersonal feature of God is not inexpressible. Granted, remember that this understanding of the Supreme as the impersonal Brahman is not the all in all. It's just a partial understanding of him. Nevertheless, some spiritual seekers wish to stop at this impersonal level of realization of God. Thus, Brahman is both a level of consciousness or realization of God, as well as a temporary destination for the impersonal spiritual seekers. Those belonging to the impersonalist school actually wish to merge with God. They wish to merge with the impersonal Brahman. However, we can never become God. And so this attempt to merge with God by the impersonal spiritual seekers is actually a fruitless endeavor. We are all individual souls, and since we are eternally one with and separate from Krishna, even such merging with the Supreme Lord is not a permanent state, and thus impersonal spiritual paths are not ultimately viable. They do not help us to relate to the Lord personally, which is what he urges us to do in the Gita, and which is what will ultimately satisfy us as well, to have that personal relationship with him. Now, hopefully at this point, we can already see how the impersonal realization of the Supreme as Brahman, as eternal existence, is not very lively. Brahman is actually described to be the brilliant effulgence of the Supreme Person, Krishna, and that is why the image on screen is of a brilliant light. And we cannot have a relationship with the Brahman effulgence of the Supreme. We can't permanently merge with Brahman. And yet, we can still use the impersonal feature of God to our spiritual advantage. How? Well, we talked a little while ago about how Krishna is actually the Supreme Person, the most attractive person in all of existence. And yet we can't see Krishna before us right now. To see him, we have to purify our consciousness. We have to engage in spiritual practices which help us to see him. We will talk about these spiritual practices, or sadhana as they are known, in future talks. In fact, we've already covered one of them in a previous class, and that is mantra meditation, or the practice of chanting the names of the Supreme Lord. However, even while we are undergoing the process of purification, while we are practicing our spiritual sadhana, we can still appreciate Krishna's impersonal feature in the material world around us. And in fact, doing so is beneficial for us. It can actually help us begin to see how he pervades all of existence as his impersonal Brahman feature. This is one way in which we can purify our consciousness, to remember that everything is Krishna's energy in some way or the other. Remembering Krishna in our daily lives is, after all, the goal, because constant remembering of God will facilitate our cultivation of a personal relationship with him. To illustrate these points, there is actually a beautiful series of verses in the 7th chapter of the Gita, in which Krishna explains himself to us in less personal terms, but in ways that allow us to be conscious of him during our everyday life experiences. As an example, in Gita chapter 7, verse 8, Krishna says, "I am the taste of water, the light of the sun and the moon, the syllable Om in the Vedic mantras. I am the sound in ether and ability in humans." It's a beautiful verse. And in the purport or explanation to this verse, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada writes, "This verse explains how the Lord is all-pervasive by his diverse material and spiritual energies. The Supreme Lord can be preliminarily perceived by his different energies, and in this way he is realized impersonally. The Lord, although in his eternal abode, is perceived by his all-pervading, diffusive energies. The taste of water is the active principle of water. No one likes to drink seawater because the pure taste of water is mixed with salt. Attraction for water depends on the purity of the taste, and this pure taste is one of the energies of the Lord. The impersonalist perceives the presence of the Lord in water by its taste, and the personalist also glorifies the Lord for his kindly supplying tasty water to quench our thirst. That is the way of perceiving the Supreme. Practically speaking, there is no conflict between personalism and impersonalism. One who knows God knows that the impersonal conception and personal conception are simultaneously present in everything, and that there is no contradiction. Now, in this purport, Srila Prabhupada nicely describes how Krishna has an impersonal feature, about which we've been discussing today. But that's not all that God is. Krishna is not only the taste of water or the light of the sun and the moon, he is also our dearest friend. But how can he be our dearest friend? Wouldn't he need to know us very intimately? Well, he does. And that will take us to the next understanding of the Supreme as his localized aspect of Paramatma, who resides in the heart of every living entity. The Paramatma aspect of the Supreme will be the subject of our discussion next week. Thank you all for listening today. Please send in any and all questions related to this talk or any of the talks that we have given before, so that our discussions may continue. And stay tuned for part 2 next time on Bhakti Fundamentals about the Paramatma aspect of the Supreme.